Welcome to the Report Card, Nat Malkus. Today's episode is a little different than what we usually do here on the Report Card. Instead of a conversation, we're bringing you an adapted version of a debate that took place before a live audience here at the American Enterprise Institute on January 24th. This education policy debate series is something we're excited about bringing 4 times a year, and occasionally we'll put it on the Report Card for you to listen. This first debate was over whether there should be a federal right to education, and since I introduced it at the debate, we can jump right in.
Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy studies here at AEI, and I get to be the moderator for tonight's installment of our education policy debate series. This debate series aims to gather preeminent experts on consequential and controversial topics and engage in what we at AEI...
Wait, we're going to have some experts here, not just us?
Yes, we have 4 experts. Engage in what we at AEI call the competition of ideas. And we often have events that have all 3 of those components. They have expertise, they have controversy, and the competition of ideas. But tonight, we want to take advantage of one more component, and that is the opinions of you, the audience. And we're going to do that by taking your temperature on the motion, who supports it, who is against it, and who is undecided going in. Then we're going to have our debate, and we're going to take your temperature again on those same questions. And whoever moves the most on our motion will be declared the winner of the debate. And of course, we will all win in this if we have civil discourse over engaging topics. So let me introduce tonight's topic. About 50 years ago, in 1968, Demetrio Rodriguez and a bunch of other parents in Edgewood School District joined together, and they sued, alleging that Texas's school finance policies were a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And they won in district court. The district court ruled that Texas's system of school finance was not constitutional. But that didn't hold up. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court voted by the narrowest margins, 5-4 decision, to overrule the Rodriguez case, to let the Texas school finance system stand. And there were 2 key parts of that ruling that reverberate through our education system to this day. One is that there is no federal right, explicit or implicit, to education in the U.S. Constitution. And the other one, which I'm going to let the legal minds that we've brought before you explain a little bit more in detail, is that at least as it applies to school finance, poverty is not a suspect classification. Now, the effects of this decision are still being felt 46 years later. This issue is considered settled by some, but there are recent lawsuits in Connecticut, Michigan, Mississippi, and one that's gearing up right now in Rhode Island, asking the courts to approach this question again, whether there should be a right to a federal education and whether it's necessary to fulfill the promise in Brown v. Board of Education that education must be made available to all on equal terms. Now, opponents have a different view. They say that actually constitutionally there is no federal right to education and no room for it. And besides, in 50 states, there is a constitutional right to education, and therefore maybe not a need for a federal role. Who is right? I'm not sure, but let's debate that tonight. Let me explain how this debate will pursue. I'm going to let you vote in just a moment on the motion, and then we will have opening statements from the proponents of the motion and the opponents of the motion, who I'll introduce in a minute. We'll give them 3 minutes apiece to make their opening statements. Following that, I'll have a period of moderated Q&A where our debaters can answer me and talk to each other directly in crosstalk as we have a period of debate. And then I will open it up to you, the audience, both the audience here and the audience watching online, to ask questions. And again, we will allow our debaters to answer your questions and discuss them with each other. Following those 2 sections, we'll have each debater give a 2-minute closing argument. And finally, you'll get to vote to deliver our decision tonight. All right, so introductions. First, I want to thank our panel. I'll let you applaud in a minute, but we really have some preeminent legal scholars here to debate this motion. First, in support of the motion, Kimberly Robinson is the Austin E. Owen Research Scholar and Law Professor at the University of Richmond School of Law and a visiting professor at the University of Virginia Law School. She's the author of the forthcoming volume, Thoughts on a Federal Right to Education. And she's also the co-editor of The Enduring Legacy of Rodriguez, Creating New Pathways to Equal Educational Opportunity. Those two books make her an excellent candidate for being here tonight. Kimberly, you speak a lot on these subjects. I wonder if you can tell us briefly, how receptive are folks here in D.C. to the idea of a federal right to education?
So I think right now we're at a point where there's been a substantial retreat in the federal loan education, and that's evident in the Every Student Succeeds Act. But I do think as we continue to see disparities in equal educational opportunity, disparities that harm poor children, children of color, children in rural communities, I think we're going to see an appetite for some bold reforms that would address that issue, and a federal right is well positioned to be one of those. So I think as we look for solutions to our opportunity gaps and our achievement gaps, a federal right to education should be one of those things on the table.
Well, we will see that tonight. Ilya Shapiro is going to kick off to argue against the motion. Ilya is the director of the Robert A. Levy Center on Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. He's also the author of Religious Liberties for Corporations, Hobby Lobby, the Affordable Care Act, and the Constitution. Ilya provides commentary on CNN, Fox News, CBS, and other networks frequently. Ilya, I wonder how often a federal right to education comes up on cable news.
I don't think it's come up, but a federal right to health care came up recently, so all sorts of far-fetched things do emerge, you know.
Derek Black joins Kimberly in support of the motion. Derek is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law, where he studies con law and public education, particularly in regard to educational inequality. And before teaching, he was a civil rights litigator. Derek, I wonder if you can briefly tell us, how far do you think we've come on educational equity since Rodriguez?
Well, I will be brief. I would say we have come from outrageous inequality to egregious inequality.
Okay, that is understood. Finally, and certainly not least, Earl Maltz, arguing against the motion, a distinguished professor at law at Rutgers Law School, where he focuses on constitutional law, statutory interpretation, the role of courts, and legal history. Earl is the author of 9 books and over 50 articles on constitutional law. Earl, you've watched the Supreme Court for some time. I wonder, what are the chances of this court turning over Rodriguez soon?
Less than 0.
Okay, less than 0. Audience, would you give our debaters a round of applause? All right, we're ready for our first round of opening statements. Opening for the supporting side of the motions. The Supreme Court was wrong on Rodriguez. There should be a federal right to education. Kimberly Robinson.
All right, well, thank you, Nat, and to AEI for having me here today. I'm really excited about this topic. So I'm going to provide 3 reasons in my opening remarks for why we should have a federal right to education. I'm sure I'll provide others during our discussion. So first, the court in Rodriguez relied upon the laboratory of the states to address inequality in spending and educational opportunity. And the court was very clear that there needed to be greater equality of opportunity and there needed to be school funding reform, but it said that the state should be the ones to address that. Well, almost 50 years later, we've had some improvement, as Derek alluded to, in narrowing opportunity gaps. However, the laboratory of the states largely has been ineffective in ensuring that all children have equal access to an excellent education. And certainly an excellent education or high-quality education is what we want not only for our own children, but for other people's children and for our nation. And it's critical to have an educated citizenry, to have an effective workforce, and to have a well-prepared military. And so what we want to understand is that the states have not provided for equitable funding. Here's one data point I'll provide on that. So a recent report by the Education Law Center showed that 37 states provide either equal or less funding to high poverty districts. Why is that important? Researchers agree that low-income children and communities need more funding. How much more? About 40% is the low end, more than double is the high end, but researchers are in consensus that they need more funding. However, we have 37 states that don't provide additional funding, and even in those states that do provide additional funding, the funding is nowhere close to what researchers say is needed. And so we have a situation where the Laboratory of the States has failed to address the needs of many communities as well as our nation, and we need to have a federal remedy to address that. So that's my second point. We need those in states where equitable funding is not provided for a high-quality education. You need a federal remedy to address that. The state courts have not provided a sufficient remedy in many places, and in many places they've said, no, the state legislature has the sole control to do what they want. And so we need federal intervention to address that. And then my final point is that the federal government is the sole level of government that can address interstate disparities. Actually, the greatest disparities are between states, and only the federal government has the capacity, the ability, and the interest to address these disparities. So for these reasons, we need a federal right to education.
Thank you, Kimberly Robinson. All right, starting off opening statements against the motion is Ilya Shapiro, and I'll hand him his 3 minutes now.
You know, when I was first presented the invitation opportunity to talk about this issue, I kind of found myself scratching my head, because how can there be a federal right to education when the Constitution doesn't give the federal government any power to regulate or legislate in this area at all? When I'm asked a constitutional question, and Earl is going to be the focus in our opening statements on the constitutional dimension here for us, but when I'm asked a constitutional question, I have this quaint way of responding by first actually looking at the constitutional text. And in this, by the way, is the Cato Pocket Constitution. You'll be able to pick it up in the reception afterwards. You get the Declaration of Independence included there for free. This is a special Shapiro wedding edition that we gave to our guests with our names and the date there. My wife's a very tolerant lady. Anyway, Article 1, Section 8 enumerates all the 17 powers that Congress gets, plus the necessary and proper clause, whatever is necessary to enforce those powers. And education is simply not one of them. So this is kind of this utopian abstraction that we're talking about in the first place. Moreover, none of these, when we talk about constitutional rights, in no way do we generally or normally think about positive rights. That is, things that the government is supposed to give you rather than the liberty and rights that the government protects. If we establish, either constitutionally or statutorily, a federal right to education, well, then what about things that seem even more important than education? Food, healthcare, shelter, clothing. These, education is important, very important, but these things are probably even more important. So it really opens up a Pandora's box. Really, the best solutions are provided for by federalism, by the way that our government is normally supposed to operate. And Kimberly says, I don't dispute that the various states' education policy generally, and including the unconstitutional federal part, has failed a large part of the American population. But bad policy does not somehow create new constitutional rights. Just like when Congress won't act, doesn't mean the president gets more powers than he otherwise would. Similarly, bad state court rulings don't give more power to federal courts or to Congress or the federal government. If we make this a right to an education or a right to a certain level of funding, a right to a certain level of educational outcomes, some sort of right, then this really is a lawyer full employment act, because you will see litigation every which way in every state about every little aspect. And so, luckily, I'm used to speaking a lot to lawyers, and with all of you, I don't have to dumb down my presentation as much. But no offense to lawyers, I really don't think we should have a lawyer full employment act.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ilya Shapiro. In an opening statement in support of the motion, we now have Derek Black.
If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Thomas Jefferson, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. From the beginning, public education has been bound up in the very idea of our democracy. What a Republican form of government looks like, what it means to be a nation where the humblest among us can reach to the highest ranks of the economy and government office, what it means to be a nation where we can set our own destiny, where those chances are not a product of one's lineage or heritage, but individual merit. And you can see this in our very earliest foundational ideas and when those ideas were put to paper. In the thinking and actions of our first presidents and in our failures across time, you can see our national commitment to public education. Our nation has failed to reach its goals in education far too many times, but we have also redoubled our efforts after those failures. It is not our failures, but our aspirations that define our commitment to public education. Although he was from a different generation, President Lincoln spoke these truths about the arc of our foundational ideas. Speaking of the Declaration of Independence and the fact that many people were still shackled and chained at the moment that it was drafted, he said that the founders were fully aware that it was not the case that all men were enjoying equality. They meant to set a standard maxim for free society, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading its deep influence. That, Lincoln says, is the story of equality in America. That, I say, is the story of public education in America. And I give you 3 major points to establish it. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that set the terms by which all the states that weren't already part of this nation, that weren't colonies, in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that is in the front matter of every copy of the United States Code, right next to the United States Constitution, right next to the Declaration of Independence, right next to the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance says, as a necessity of good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. 75 years later, when Congress was determining whether it would readmit southern states after they had broken the promise of democracy and had deprived both whites and blacks of public education and were forced to adopt new state constitutions and a 14th Amendment, Congress readmitted them with a very specific term, that the Constitution of these states shall never be so amended or changed as to deprive any citizen or class of citizens of the United States of the school rights and privileges in those state constitutions.
I'm sorry, Derek, your time is up, but we'll let you get to your other points in the further debate. And thank you, Derek. Speaking last in opening statements against the motion, Earl Maltz.
So Rodriguez was based upon an interpretation of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. So in order to answer the question of whether Rodriguez should be overruled, we have to ask ourselves the question of what Section 1 of the 14th Amendment was designed to do. Now, education was not a big discussion point during the debates. However, there was one major discussion in general terms of what Section 1 was designed to do in the Senate by Jacob Howard, who was presenting the amendment from the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which had drafted it. And Howard made it clear that the 14th Amendment, Section 1, was designed to only protect a certain group of rights. And this is the way he divided it. The rights that were to be protected were, quote, those fundamental rights lying at the basis of all society without which a people cannot exist except as slaves. And you might say, that might include public education, except he juxtaposes that and says a group of rights which are not protected. Those rights which are merely the creature of law and the result of positive local law. Now, whatever one might say about the right to public education, it can only be the creature of law, the result of positive local law. So, therefore, under Section 1, it's not covered. Now, Derek argues that we should interpret the 14th Amendment by reference to what was required of the southern states. The problem with that is that other things which were clearly required of the southern states were clearly not covered by Section 1. And the most important of those was the provisions dealing with the right to vote. Now, the right to vote has a very interesting history in the 14th Amendment. That it was in the prohibition on discrimination on the basis of race and the right to vote was actually in the amendment until the very last moment, when in reaction to political blowback and the fear that it would doom the amendment, Congress took it out of the amendment so that it's not there. And it was very clearly, again, Howard said, it's not there. There was a conscious decision. How that relates to the education point is the way it relates to Derek's point about what was required of the southern states. Congress required a lot of things from the southern states that were not covered by Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you for opening statements from all our debaters. I'm going to, the affirmative side bears the burden on the first question, and I invite everybody to jump in, but I will start by asking just a definitional question. We're asking, should there be a federal right to education? But I want to challenge you to help put some flesh on that. What exactly does that mean? And I ask that because Rodriguez was about funding formulas and dollars. But since Rodriguez, we've had quite a bit of discussion in education policy circles on the distribution of educational facilities, curricula, quality teachers. And education is such an irreducibly multidimensional thing that I'm wondering, what is the right to?
So I think would be something that there would be wide disagreement on, but I think there are some fundamentals that we could ultimately agree upon as a nation. There are some building blocks that we need for education to be high quality and for it to be equitably distributed. So certainly equitable funding is essential. As I mentioned, just additional funding for those who have greater needs is essential for them to compete on a level playing field with their peers. Other additional necessary resources include a well-qualified teacher, teachers who are prepared to equip students with what they need to be productive in the workforce and to be engaged citizens. And so one of the goals, I think, of federal right to education would be to ensure that we have citizens who are prepared to engage in democracy. So that's not only voting in an informed fashion, but that's also serving on a jury in an intelligible manner, and engaging in the public discourse of debates. But I think part of what the nation needs is a discussion about what should each child be entitled to. But then I think we have to make a national commitment to provide it. And right now, what we provide is the more privileged segments of our society get an excellent education, and everyone else sort of gets the remnants of state and local budgets. And that is something I think that must change.
And so before, I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and then I'll give the opposition side a chance to weigh in. And that is, what is the mechanism that would sort of enforce this right? And I'm just asking because I don't know. We have multidimensional aspects that you've alluded to, which I understand. But is this only in the courts? Is this sort of the Department of Education? How would we enforce this?
So actually, this is the very question that my forthcoming book addresses, which is how would we recognize a right to education? So Derek has an excellent chapter on recognizing the implied right to education through the Constitution. I include a chapter about Congress recognizing such a right under the Spending Clause, which Congress has the authority under the Spending Clause to act and enact legislation for the general welfare. In addition, I have a chapter in the book about a constitutional amendment. So there are several avenues through which you could recognize such a right. It could be enforced in the courts. It could be something that was enacted in statute and that you engage in a collaborative enforcement model, which is what I've written about in my work. But the point is that there are multiple ways to get there. It's just important to think about ultimately what the goals are and how the goals could most effectively be achieved.
Response?
Sure. First of all, again, I'm sorry I have this predilection to look at the Constitution when constitutional text is cited, but the General Welfare Clause is actually not a grant of powers to the government. It's a restriction of the powers that are then enumerated. What the General Welfare Clause is, this is Article 1, Section 8, for those of you following along. Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, impose excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, by doing the following things. General welfare means it cannot do these things for a regional or particular or parochial welfare. So it's not that whatever there's a majority in Congress for, which is a representation of general welfare, it gets the power to do. So it is not just an open-ended grant of majoritarianism in Congress. Now, everything that Kimberly says may or may not be solid policy arguments. It could be that states need to change radically, I would argue they should, how they maintain public education. I think a lot of educators are hamstrung by regulations, both from the state and especially from the unconstitutional federal Department of Education. You free them up, whether through charter schools, other innovations, and that's what's really going to release the better policy. So perhaps she's actually arguing for the constitutionalization of school choice. Is that a right that we have to have more educational freedom? That might be a subject for a different debate, but it's been raised in various contexts.
Earl, Derek?
I was just going to jump in on that sort of what I would call slightly cramped version of the general welfare. If we're going to suggest that Congress cannot spend in the general welfare and education, then I think we need to get another motion up here that redefines how the court has treated the general welfare clause for the past century. And we could do that as well, but that motion is clearly rejected by the Supreme Court for quite a long time.
Can I ask a question about what seems to me a central part of the Rodriguez decision itself, which was that poverty should not be treated as a suspect class? Earl, could you explain just briefly to the audience what that means, and do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, it's complicated with respect to Rodriguez, but the answer to that is that, so what the court said was that if you look at the history of the 14th Amendment, that there is race and a couple of other things that are entitled discrimination on the basis of race, and the problem that are entitled to what's called strict scrutiny. The problem with a generalized holding that poverty is a suspect classification is that it would challenge things, for example, like the use of fees for all sorts of things. And the court said we just don't want to go there. We don't want to have that generalized thing. And certainly there is nothing in the text or history of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment that would suggest that such discrimination should be subjected to strict scrutiny. That was a complicated question, but that's as good as I can do for an answer.
Indeed, and the opposition, I'm assuming both of you hold that certainly poverty should not be allowed as a suspect classification. And
yeah, I don't disagree with what Earl said on that. I don't think there's much support for the idea that there's a generalized heightened scrutiny. But I would say if government targets poor children, or actually any group in society, just for sort of animus-related reasons, even under rational basis review, the court is going to take a very close look at that, and we've seen that with legislation against hippies during the 70s. We saw it in Romer versus Evans with LGBTQ in Colorado. That was rational basis. It's just suspiciousness of targeting someone to harm them. But yes, I would agree with what
right. No, whether it's animus or targeting or arbitrary government action, effectively that fails this rational basis test. Hat wearers are not a protected class. But if the government, any government, state or federal, passes a law saying anyone wearing a hat will be shot on sight, even that not being a protected class, I think there are some constitutional issues.
Well, let me ask about this in practical terms then. So just to give a very brief background, Edgewood School District could tax themselves at a much higher rate than other districts in Texas, but because they had such little property wealth, they couldn't raise as much as richer school districts could, taxing themselves at a lower rate. This was what caused the rub in the Rodriguez case. And we still have that today. Property tax still fuels our education system. My question to the opponents of the motion is the combination of the Rodriguez decision and the ubiquity of property tax, does that just mean that our system of funding schools is inherently inequitable? Yeah.
Well, there are two separate questions. There's a separate question about inherently inequitable and a separate question of unconstitutional. Actually, there are three, and a separate question of what are we going to do about those things. So you could look at the world and say that it's inequitable compared to what they spend in Mississippi to what they spend in where I live in, where I grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland, for example. And one could imagine, even under, maybe not, I don't want to speak for Ilya, even under Ilya's view of this taxing and spending clause, that maybe the federal government could give block grants to school districts which are underfunded. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but as taxing or spending for the general welfare. But then the devil is in the details. And the problem is that once the federal government starts to have detailed rules about how the money is going to be spent, where the money is going to be spent, the conditions under which it's going to be spent, then we create problems because schools are not able to adapt to local conditions. And let me give you 30 seconds as an example. I forgot what used to be called the Education, I guess it's called the Education for Children with Disabilities Act. That one particular group of people captured the education, and that is the pro-mainstreaming people, right? That you were supposed to mainstream people all the time, if you can. Well, it just so happens that one of my sons works at a facility for developmentally disabled children, and that just doesn't work. The mainstreaming just doesn't work for all developmentally disabled children. The point being that even if you gave block grants, you would want to give the states some leeway to try and decide what works best for them.
I think it's a mischaracterization to say that if we had a federal right to education, there's going to be minute micromanagement of education by the federal government. What a federal right to education could do is set a floor of educational opportunity below which states cannot go. And unfortunately, right now, we are stepping on the heads of many children and communities by providing them inadequate and inferior educational opportunities. And so the challenge is, what do we do about that? And so what the answer has been so far in our country is leave it to the states. Leave it to the states to figure it out, because under federalism, we rely upon the laboratory of the states to fix these things. However, there must come a day in which we recognize that the laboratory of the states is failing our nation and our children and future generations, and then what will we do about it? And so my work seeks to present not just a federal right to education, but just a reimagining of federal support for high-quality education for all children, in which there's a partnership between the federal and state government. It's not that it's a federal takeover. It's not that the federal government gets to tell you what time the school day starts and what time it ends and what school holidays you can recognize. But it is saying that you cannot continue to provide an inferior education to disadvantaged communities, to communities of color, and to limited English proficient students. And that is something that is consistent with the tenets of our democracy and is critical to the success of our economy.
Let me ask you something about it that was true when Rodriguez was decided. The federal government spent about 10% of education dollars. It's true today, about 10 or 11%. If we had a federal right to education, this change that you're advocating for, would that need to change? Do you anticipate that the federal government would have a larger role in expenditures? And if not, what would the government's expanded role be? Federal government?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you go about this federal right. So the answer is, if what we're going to do is spend through the general welfare, which isn't really a federal right, that's just the federal government sort of playing a larger role, although it may be thinking that it's doing something based upon a federal right. But it can do that without the recognition of a federal right. So if it's doing it through the general welfare, then I believe, they're going to have to spend probably 2 to 3 times as much, because, if I'm, I don't know, I'm not going to pick if I'm whatever state, I'm not changing my practices for 10%. I mean, even Utah thought about turning down No Child Left Behind, and they were getting more money out of it. So I think there would have to be more investment. If what Congress was doing was acting pursuant to an implied or explicit, with a constitutional amendment in education, then it would have Section 5 powers, and it could demand whatever it wanted as long as it could get, a majority in the House and the Senate and the President to agree on it. But at this moment in time, we don't have a recognized right. So right now, the only basis would be to go under the general welfare spending clause, and that's going to cost 2 or 3 times as much at least.
But I will say what you referenced when you opened this is numerous litigators have returned to federal court because of the failure of the states to address these issues, and state courts have not provided adequate remedies. So I think we're going to continue to see this increase in federal court litigation. I agree that the current court is not going to recognize a right to education, but I think there may be future courts that could do so. And so the return to federal court is an indication that state courts are not providing the remedies that communities need.
Well, state courts are better situated to interpret state constitutions, which is where most of the rights are currently situated before we have a federal right. But regardless, as the newly named chairman of the advisory board of the Mississippi Justice Institute, I have to say that I resent some of the implications here. I think Mississippi is up to 48 or 47 on most of these measures. But it's not a matter of funding, though, is the serious point. The best funded public school district in the country, I think, is right here in Washington, D.C. in terms of spending per pupil. A lot of the highest spending districts in the country are also the worst performing in various ways. So I don't think it's simply a matter of funding. A lot of charter and parochial schools get a lot better outcomes on fractions on the dollar, and part of that is regulation, and part of that is the power of teachers' unions, and part of it is federal mandates and other things that are hamstringing the public education system.
So I'll just unveil that because I used to work for the District of Columbia Schools when I was an attorney with Hogan and Lovells, then Hogan and Hartson. So there's a myth about how high DC spends. It does have a high expenditure rate, but if you look at research that breaks down how much is going actually to the classroom and how much is going to special education under the IDEA, then you will see actually that a large part of the DC schools budget goes to special education, particularly to paying for children to go outside of the district for services the district cannot administer. So when you take off those funds and you look at the dollars that actually go to the classroom, you actually do not have a very well-funded system in DC. There are improvements that the superintendents are working on, the chancellors are working. But my point is, there's this myth that DC is the example of why more money doesn't work. But that's an uneducated view about how DC schools are funded.
I have a question about the federalism question. Local control is pretty sacred in a lot of places in the United States. And so to the supporters' side, I ask, is there value to local control? And also, is it at odds with a federal right to education?
Well, I'm going to break the rules. First, I want to say just quickly that Carabo-Jackson's the sort of best study out there. Looking at 40 years of school funding data, no doubt about it, school funding matters in terms of student outcomes. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, did a study of the metro area here and showed actually D.C. was underfunded in comparison to all the surrounding ones. To your question, yes, there is value in local control, and I have always been careful to acknowledge it. I think that eliminating local control would be a bad thing. I would say at this point in time, though, that local control has been shrinking because state power has been growing. So we see local control shrinking regardless of the federal role at this point. And I think we do need parental involvement. We do need local involvement, and that's a key factor in student success as well.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that so often we argue for local control. We can't have a federal this because of local control. We can't have a federal that because of local control. However, we have to understand that local control is not an end of itself. It is a means to achieve excellence. And if local control is not achieving excellence, then we need to modify that system and engage in a greater partnership and support from other levels of government that can help the locality to achieve its goals more effectively.
So let me ask the opposition to come in. Is local control a good thing? I'm not sure what you're going to weigh in on that. And is it in tension with a federal right to education?
It would be in tension with a federal right to education, but I think another thing that discussions of local control that's sometimes missing is that sometimes different areas simply have different values. And when you can talk in general terms about excellence, but there's also a variety of different values in addition to this concept of the laboratories of democracy. And I go back to the IDEA about how it sort of cramped that laboratory of democracy idea. But there's also the idea of different places have different values, and they should have some say in how their education reflects those values.
This ultimately is the most important point. The reason why we have so much gridlock and toxicity in our current politics is because all major decisions in all major areas of policy are pushed up to Washington, whether the Supreme Court, whether Congress, whether the executive agencies. And for a large pluralistic society with different values and priorities and what have you, that's the exact wrong way to do it. Subsidiarity, even more than federalism. I mean, if you're Catholic or European, subsidiarity might ring in your ears. It means pushing down decision-making to the lowest possible level, because that's the way you get the flexibility, and that's the way you turn down tension. So it's not Washington making the same decisions for, there's no reason the healthcare, education, whatever system has to be the same in California and Ohio and Florida and Virginia.
So, quick question to the supporters before we move to audience questions. And if you have a question, I'd encourage you to come up to one of the microphones on the side and offer that up in just a couple of minutes here. But one of the questions that has come up briefly is that an excellent education system is a prerequisite for participating in our democracy and so forth. And I want to ask to develop that line of thinking, and if that is enough to establish a right to education or a theory there, and just how you construct that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my friends get upset with me because I really do limit it to citizenship, and that doesn't necessarily include STEM. And they're like, how could you talk about a right to education that doesn't include STEM? And my answer is, because my understanding of the education that our democracy demands is one that prepares for citizenship, not for computers. With that said, I don't have any fear that somehow or another we would have a bunch of schools that were excellent at preparing citizenship and didn't care whether they learned math or not. So, I mean, yes, I don't include it in my core concept, but that doesn't bother me as a practical matter.
I'll ask one other question because I'm allowed to. I'm the moderator. There's a question even in our motion that the Supreme Court was wrong on Rodriguez, that there must be something in the Constitution to have a federal right for education. Is there another viable route to establish a federal right to education, and what would that look like? Either side can take that.
So I definitely think that Congress could recognize a right to education under the 14th Amendment through Section 5. I think that's also possible. I think that it could approximate something similar to a right through the spending clause as well. So I think Congress definitely has the authority. In fact, there have been numerous pieces of legislation that have been proposed in Congress but have not been successful that have tried to establish such a right. But I do think there's a full body of scholarship as well, not just on Congress recognizing such a right, but also implying such a right in the Constitution. So I think there's multiple avenues how it could be recognized.
Response?
Congress can pass a law of all sorts of things, and that creates a right of some sort. It's a statutory right. Courts have to evaluate that against the Constitution, of course, but it depends on whether your right is worth the paper it's written on. So I don't know exactly how that would look, but sure, Congress can pass a law saying you have a right to X, Y, Z.
Well, I might just repeat what John Powell said about a decade ago, which is really a critique of Congress. There is not a single thing that needs to be done in our schools, not a single thing that Congress cannot do tomorrow, because it does have the resources to do it. It chooses not to. So regardless of whether there's a federal constitutional right or not, Congress is complicit in its failure to spend to address our national interest, and it has been complicit for quite some time in that respect.
Because we have such a surplus in our budget.
I think just a couple of airplanes would cover it, actually, yeah.
So let's talk about that spending, and I'm going to wait for folks to line up at the microphones before I turn it over to you for questions. So please come up on either side. Derek, you mentioned that we would have to spend a lot more, but I also wonder in the context of No Child Left Behind, other federal reforms, it's arguable that just with actually the same 10% of spending, that the federal government administratively has been able to get a lot of the changes they want to see. Is that a viable route in your eyes towards some of the ways that we could improve equity without actually invoking this sort of federal right?
On equity, yes. I'm going to say something that might surprise some folks. We got a lot of education change during the Obama administration for a very little bit of money. And I think that Arne Duncan overstepped his statutory authority in doing so. In fact, I argued that even if it was in his statutory authority, I believe it was unconstitutional. So I won't go into all those reasons why, but I do think there are limits to what the federal government can demand in exchange for money and the sort of changing of the rules. I think school funding is actually simpler in terms of what we're actually asking you to do, but it's a much bigger lift for the states, and 10% will not buy that from the states. If I was a state governor, I would say no. For 10%, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, and part of the concern actually is that what we have right now is we have this very limited 10% investment in education by the federal government, but the federal government still asked for quite a bit, at least under No Child Left Behind it. It rolled that back quite a bit in the Every Student Succeeds Act. But this is a very flawed model of federalism. If you were going to ask for much, the federal government needs to be investing much. And that would be a much more effective model for federalism if you're going to be demanding a lot from the states, particularly more equitable funding. Then the federal government's got to be willing to help do the heavy lifting for making that happen.
Earl, Ilya, response before we go to audience questions? All right, so I'll take audience questions.
First, an audience member wanted to know whether intellectual diversity adds positive value to American education. Do communities' different values have an impact on whether we provide students an equal education as a nation? Here's what our debaters had to say.
Intellectual diversity is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely, it is, and this is part of the problem with having one-size-fits-all state schools. It's that you're going to be getting kind of one perspective on things. But yeah, intellectual diversity is really important.
Can I answer that question as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
We also agree.
Diversity is a good thing, but I was going to say this sort of idea of different values. I guess we could define what that means. I don't think that communities do have different values when it comes to a quality education. I think the fact that we see so many children running from public schools, to be quite honest, in places like Detroit and New Orleans, is not because they have different values than some suburbs. It's because their local district lacks the capacity to serve them. They're willing to go anywhere they can get a better deal. They think they can, but then ironically they get there and they switch through 3 or 4 more charter schools. Their desire at enormous numbers is the same desire that other communities have. They just lack the capacity to access the resources that they need.
Another question from the audience was whether education outcomes are determined by teacher quality and school funding or by things outside of the school system's control, such as parental involvement, student apathy, language barriers, and other external factors. If so, what does that mean for a federal right to education?
So that's a great question. There are certainly some things that a federal right to education could help address. Foundational building blocks for next education, of which I've mentioned some: funding, high quality teachers, access to a wide-ranging curriculum. However, there are some things that a federal right and the federal government itself cannot directly change. However, there's definitely significant research that shows that a high-quality school can do a lot, can make a big difference in communities of poverty, addressing some of the issues that children bring to the classroom. Many schools are sites for social services and other things that help to support the challenges that children are facing. And so while certainly a federal right to education would not be a panacea for the ills of the nation, unfortunately in the United States we don't have an adequate social safety net to address many of the ills of our society. And so one of the challenges has been that our schools are forced to be the locus for trying to address those issues. So a federal right would not be a panacea for those things, but could certainly help to lift the floor that right now is very low in some communities.
Opportunity to respond? You need not.
Schools aren't supposed to be social service providers and all that. Fix the other. Just because other parts of our public policy might be failing, whether at a federal or state level, doesn't mean that schools ought to pick up the slack. Lest they fail at all their missions that they're given.
Debaters emphasized that a quality education is necessary for Americans to fulfill their duties as citizens. One audience member wanted to know if there were any cases where functional illiteracy had actually made it impossible for a person to fulfill their responsibilities as a citizen. For instance, fulfilling jury duty. Here's what the debaters had to say.
Michael Rebell has done a lot of work on jury service, and particularly in New York City. And so, yes, there's one argument, I haven't made it, Kimberly may have made it, that actually your ability to get a jury of your peers is substantially compromised by our education system because many of your peers are excluded from the jury pool based upon their lack of education.
Thanks for your questions, and I'd like to have a round of applause before we move to our closing statements. In the same order that the opening statements came, we'll start with closing statements from Kimberly Robinson.
Great. So I'm actually going to be very brief because I made my points throughout the debate. I think the important thing that I want to leave you with is this. We are, in education reforms, tinkering at the margins of education opportunity. We come up with a great charter school here, and we come up with a new teacher training program there, and we develop some other reform that catches everyone's attention. But what we are doing is moving chairs around a ship that is ultimately deeply flawed. And so we're not going to get to our ultimate destination of a well-educated citizenry, a robust economy, and a well-prepared military unless we change the very foundation upon which our education system is built. And so definitely, I believe strongly that a federal right to education is one way to do that. I think it also requires us to reimagine our relationship between the federal and state government. I don't think we need to fear federal involvement in education when it seeks to promote equity and excellence. And so I think we need to really re-examine what we are doing and to stop sacrificing children and communities at this altar to state and local control. We have to come up with a bold reform to get to an excellent education for all children. And I believe that a federal right to education is one way to do that.
Closing statement in support of the motion from Kimberly Robinson. And now in opposition to the motion, Ilya Shapiro.
I still don't know what a federal right to education means, even setting aside my qualms about the federal government's involvement in this area in the first place constitutionally. But is it simply a right to more money, equalizing that? Is it federal regulation of teachers or federal regulation of schoolyards? I don't know what that means. But even once you get past that point, why do we think that involving the federal government will necessarily make things better? Rather than more convoluted and stifling innovation, that we have. I'm not an education scholar by no means. I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. But it seems to me that education policy scholars ought to be working at those grassroots and local and state levels to improve education policy. I don't know what the federal government has to do. If someone's violating your civil rights in terms of discriminating against you based on your race or your religion or something like that, I mean, sure, take that to federal court. But I don't know what a federal right to education would mean other than lawyers suing over every little thing and really not getting anything done in the first place in terms of these excellent outcomes that we all want.
Closing statement by Ilya Shapiro, and now to Derek Plack in support of the motion.
I'm not going to give a closing statement. I'm just going to finish my opening one. So, 90 years after the Civil War, when the Supreme Court issued Brown versus Board of Education, it said that today education is perhaps the most important function of state and local government. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. We can debate and play with the various different ways we want to interpret the Constitution, but there is but one single story of education and this nation's commitment to it across time. And is it a story where education has always been understood to be the foundation of our democratic and constitutional commitments?
Derek Black, and finishing the day for our closing statements, Earl Maltz.
I share some of Ilya's qualms about the content of the federal right to education. Because now I can certainly imagine a situation where the federal government, as I said, would give block grants to both public schools and, frankly, to private schools to develop better educational programs. What I fear about the federal right to education is what we have seen in a wide variety of areas, that we end up with micromanagement from Washington and these very lots and lots of litigation that doesn't produce much good outcome. So, as I said, I can imagine the federal government providing more funding, but I worry about micromanagement.
And I'd like to invite everyone to join me in applauding our debaters tonight. I'm going to ask for a little speculation from our debaters now that they no longer have to sway your decision. Let's just stipulate that Rodriguez, for the moment, was correct, and that there's also a statutory path forward for a federal right to education. Which do you think is the most likely of these two paths? That the Supreme Court would overturn Rodriguez, or that a statutory right to a fulsome right to a fundamental right to education would be passed? Anyone want to take a?
The statutory right is much more likely.
Always bet on Congress trying to aggrandize its own power.
Yes, I don't. I think that interestingly, even the sort of culture of constitutional law has moved, and I think it would be, even if there got it to be a progressive majority on the court, I suspect that they would be unlikely to overrule Rodriguez because it's become so deeply embedded on our constitutional scheme.
And it would open a Pandora's box, I think, that they would be hesitant to pursue.
But a statutory thing is possible.
Supporting side?
I think a statutory right is much more likely than I think, regardless of which branch does it.
Yeah, I would just say it's quite remarkable how comfortable states have gotten with the federal role in education, notwithstanding the fact that I wrote abandoning the federal role in education recently. But generally speaking, they've gotten used to that federal role, and so I think it would be far more politically palatable.
Okay, so we can end the debate on something we can all agree. All right, I think we have a decision here.
Is the winner La La Land?
It is not. It is not. Here we go. Round one, the initial vote, 57% of the audience agreed with the motion, supported the motion. 17% were against the motion, and undecided was 26%. In the final vote, 64% of the audience agreed with the motion. That's a gain of 7 points, 7 percentage points, and that's the number to beat. For in the second round of voting against the motion, 30% of the audience, gaining 13 points, and the winner is the opposing side tonight in our debate. Thank you very much for coming. Please stay to talk to the panelists and our other guests and have another drink outside. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to this special edition of the Report Card with our Education Policy Debate Series. And thanks especially to our debaters, Kimberly Robinson, Derek Black, Earl Maltz, and Ilya Shapiro. We certainly couldn't have done it without them. This debate and podcast wouldn't be possible without the help of Connor Kurtz, Sophia Gallo, Gage Hurley, and Macy Heath. We hope you'll listen for announcements, and if you can, come to Washington, D.C. for our next education policy debate later this spring. Until next time, I'm Nat Malkus.